Hello, my name is Afradi Salmon Mejage from Edukea Tanzania. Welcome to proceed with our topic, which is the topic number 16 from 5 history, which is influence of external forces and the rise of nationalism and the struggle for independence. So on the last session, we ended on looking the peaceful way on forms of struggle for nationalism, whereby we saw the first form by studying the case study of Ghana as they used the peaceful means or constitutional method in attaining the independence. So today we are going to see another form, which is armed struggle or guerrilla war to attain the independence. And we are going to see the case study in Zimbabwe. So, armed struggle, African struggle for independence in Zimbabwe was complicated because of the dominance of white settlers. And before looking anything, I would like to provide the definition of armed struggle. To me, that this was the form of struggle for independence whereby the actual war or physical fighting between the Africans with the colonialists were conducted. So the Africans were fighting actually, or were fighting with colonialists physically by waging on actual war. For example, the countries which were involved or which were used the armed struggle to attain their independence included Angola, Zimbabwe, Kenya, that's Mozambique, and other African countries. So, African struggle for independence in Zimbabwe was complicated because of the dominance of the white settlers. To mean that as armed struggle, we are going to study the case study in Zimbabwe as the among of the country which used the armed struggle in attaining the independence. After the World War II, there was an influx of white settlers into Zimbabwe that led to the massive expropriation of African land. It means that after the Second World War, the land of Zimbabwe experienced the massive influx of white settlers in their land. So the white settlers were invested much on that land or in Zimbabwe. So it could be so difficult for them to grant independence easily. So that's why the people of Zimbabwe decided to wage on armed struggle to fight actually or physically with the colonialists or British settlers to eliminate them and to attain their self-rule. In 1951, Africans formed the All-African Confederation Convention Party that aimed at opposing the formation of Federation of 3 Central African colonies, that is Zimbabwe, Zambia, and the Nyasaland or Malawi. So, when the federal constitution was imposed in 1953, the African Convention fell apart. To me, that when the federal constitution was imposed in 1953, the African Convention was fell. That I have told you that in 1951, the Africans formed the Confederational Convention Party that aimed at opposing the formation of the Federation of 3 Central African colonies that included Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Nyasaland. But after soon the imposition of federal constitution in 1953, the African Convention Party fell apart. The white settlers consolidated their independence in 1970 when the country was proclaimed a republic. To mean that the white settlers consolidated their independence in 1950 when the country was proclaimed a republic. White settlers had sealed all hopes of peaceful transition to independence when Land Smith unilaterally declared independence in 1965. Unilateral Declaration of Independence means that when it reached in 1965, there was unilateral declaration of independence in Zimbabwe. But when it reached in 1970, the white settlers were to grant the independence of Zimbabwe. And a new nationalist party called the African National Council, ANC, was formed. The aim of the ANC was to oppose the British or Rhodesian Agreement and ensure that independence was granted to the African majority and not the African minority in Zimbabwe. Nationalist political movements experienced the setbacks in the organization. It means that the nationalist political movements that were formed in Zimbabwe experienced the massive setbacks in its organization. Despite these measures, the Africans were not discouraged. Despite these measures or these problems which faced them, they will not be discouraged. They were still to wait on different measures or strategies on ensuring that they are attaining their independence. In 1960, they formed a new political party called the Zimbabwe African People's Party, ZAP. This party was led by Joshua Nkomo, which means that when it reached in 1960, there was the formation of new political party that was called the Zimbabwe African People's Party, or known as ZAP. And the political party was led by Joshua Nkomo. ZAP was banned in 1962 and its leaders were detained, but it continued to operate underground. But it means that when it reached in 1962, ZAP was banned or was eliminated, and its leader, or it means the leader of ZAP, was detained. But it continued to proceed with its processes of attaining of struggle for independence underground without the knowing by the colonialists. A spirit in ZAP leadership in 1963 led to the formation of Zimbabwe African National Union, so-called ZANU, led by Ndabaningi Sethote. Ndabaningi Sethote. It means that this was the leader of ZANU after the formation of that political parties, as followed by the collapse of ZAP. The disintegration of the federation following the independence of Zambia and Malawi forced the Rhodesia to fight for their independence. Front political party of the white settlers to press Britain to grant independence to Zimbabwe under minority rule. It means that the front political party of the white settlers forced or pressurized Britain to grant the independence of Zimbabwe to the minority, or to grant minority rule. Britain tactfully approved this request, and on 11th November 1965, Lan Smith unilaterally declared Southern Rhodesia independence, not independent. It means Lan Smith in 1965 unilaterally declared the independence of the minority rule. And since then, African nationalist movements were engaged in a prolonged guerrilla war until the majority rule was declared in 1980. It means that since then, after the declaration of unilateral of minority independence in 1965, since then the African nationalist movements were engaged in prolonged guerrilla war or armed struggle to ensure that they attain the majority rule in 1980 when Zimbabwe got their independence. Let us see the reasons for the use of armed struggle in Zimbabwe. The first reason was banning of nationalist movements. It means that the nationalist movement that were formed in Zimbabwe to demand their independence in a peaceful way, they were banned. So the British colonial government was not ready to grant independence to Zimbabwe. It banned or suppressed many nationalistic movements in Zimbabwe, making the struggle for independence long and complicated. So there was the suppression of nationalistic movements in Zimbabwe that was done by the Africans in Zimbabwe in order to make Zimbabwe still under colonized or under the British rule. This position compelled the African nationalists to resort to the use of armed struggle to attain independence. It means that actions or that positions of the British compelled the African nationalists to resort or to use the armed struggle to attain their independence. But the second reason for the use of armed struggle in Zimbabwe to attain their independence was tribalism. Tribalism hindered the struggle for independence in Zimbabwe. Most of the nationalist movements were divided along the tribal lines. The dominant tribe were the Shona and Indep. Due to the tribalism, the African nationalists could not put a common front against the colonialists. Thus, the only alternative left was to use armed struggle to attain independence. It means that they could not unite together between the tribes which were present in Zimbabwe, like the major tribes which were Shona and Indep in Zimbabwe, were not ready to unite together to fight for independence through peaceful means. So the alternative way which they saw was to use the armed struggle to fight against their colonialists in order to attain the majority rule. Another was the richness of Zimbabwe. It means that Zimbabwe was rich or is rich. So the colonial masters were not ready to grant the independence, fearing to lose those richness or that wealth which were in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is so rich in terms of minerals such as gold and diamond, and it has enough fertile soil that can support the growth of cash crops that were needed in the metropolitan countries. The richness of the colony made it difficult for the colonial government to grant independence. This made the Africans to use armed struggle. It means that Zimbabwe to be rich made the British government or British colonialists to be not ready to grant the independence to the majority of Zimbabwe, because there were plenty minerals and the fertile land which could support the production of cash crops which were needed or highly needed in the metropolitan countries in Europe. So the presence of minerals like gold and diamond as well as fertile soil for the British were not ready to grant the independence to the people of Zimbabwe or majority rule. That's why the people of Zimbabwe decided to use armed struggle as the means of struggling for their independence. But the first one was establishment of settler economy. The white settlers had established a settler economy in Zimbabwe, where they had invested so much in plantation farms and mining activities. So you can see that many of the white settlers who were found in Zimbabwe were highly invested in plantations, farms, as well as mining centers. So they could not be either to grant independence so that they could not lose those wealth whereby they were invested much, like mining centers, farms and plantations, which were mainly producing the demands of metropolitan countries. The massive investment made the colonial government reluctant to grant the African independence, because it would tantamount to scarifying all the wealth in Zimbabwe. It means that if the colonialists could grant the independence to the Zimbabwe, it means that they could lose the wealth which were found in Zimbabwe. So that's why that's why the colonialists were reluctant to grant the African independence. Another was harshness of the colonial government, meaning that the British government were harsh in terms of colonizing or dominating the country. So you can see that the colonial government was very harsh in Zimbabwe. Nationalist leaders were imprisoned and the government pursued policies such as forced labor, whereby to implement these travel passes were introduced to try and limit the movement of the people. It means that in Zimbabwe there was harsh colonial rules or harsh colonial administration, whereby the British government were actually treating the Zimbabwe or the people of Zimbabwe, and that's why some leaders were imprisoned and others were expelled to go into the exile. And the government pursued policies such as forced labor, whereby that act were forcing the people of Zimbabwe to work by force without their will, and they introduced the pass ID that could limit, or that could try to limit the movement of the people within the country. So in that means the people of Zimbabwe decided to use the alternative, the main method of armed struggle to fight against the colonialists in order to attain their self-rule. But another was disunity. It means that there was disunity. The political parties in Zimbabwe were not united, thus it became very difficult for them to present a common front against the colonial government. It means that there were sharp differences between the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZAP, and Zimbabwe African People's Party, ZAP. So this difference left the African nationalists like Mugabe with no choice but to use armed struggle, which means that the disunity among the political parties which were formed in Zimbabwe made the nationalist movement to be difficult to attain the self-rule, because they had no common agreement or common objective or common choice or common decision to fight against the colonialists and to attain their independence. So that's why they tried to use the armed struggle so that they could attain their independence. In 1980, Zimbabwe attained our independence from the British rule. Another was the support of the imperialist power. It means that Zimbabwe had experienced the support from abroad, for example, USA and other countries or powers from Europe. The Zimbabwe minority regime was supported by the imperialist powers in order to defend their interests. It means that minority people or minority regime that was planted in 1965 and land was supported by the imperialist powers like USA, France, and German that were there to support the imperialist interests or to defend the interests of that imperialist powers. This was seen when powers like USA, France, and German failed to observe the United Nations sanctions called against the land Thmis minority regime. So that's why the people of Zimbabwe decided to use the armed struggle to eliminate or to move or to suppress the British colonial administration, and that's why Zimbabwe attained their independence by the use of armed struggle. Something to note, these factors compelled the African nationalist leaders to use armed struggle. Majority rule in Zimbabwe was achieved in 1980. It means that all these factors which I have explained were the factors that made Zimbabwe or people of Zimbabwe to use armed struggle to attain their majority rule. And in 1980, the majority rule or independence of Zimbabwe for majority was achieved. And the Robert Mugabe become the first president of Zimbabwe. Let us see another case study of armed struggle in Portuguese colonies, means Angola and Mozambique. The early political movements in Angola developed mainly along ethnic lines. The initial political parties expressed cultural activities like praising African culture. To me, that there was early movements in Angola that were developed along the ethnic lines or ethnic groups, and that these initial political parties expressed cultural activities like praising African culture. In December 1956, the Movement for People's Liberation of Angola, MPLA, advocated for equal rights of the all colonized people irrespective of their color, creed, or tribe. In 1962, the Front for National Liberation of Angola, FNLA, was formed. By this time, there were two major liberation movements, that the MPLA and the FNLA, with their leaders. Those all were fighting for the independence. Later, the FNLA split, thus creating another liberation movement called the Union for Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, under the leadership of Jonas Savimbi. It means that FNLA was split or was collapsed or was divided, and that led to the formation of another liberation movement called the UNITA, or Union for Total Independence of Angola, under the leadership of Jonas Savimbi. UNITA declared that it would stand for full independence of Angola, and that political party under Jonas Savimbi declared that they could stand for the full independence of Angola. A positive element in the struggle for independence occurred in 1974 at a meeting in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the MPLA and the FNLA adopted a common front in their struggle for independence. So you can see that the positive element in the struggle for independence occurred in 1974 at a meeting in Zaire, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the MPLA and the FNLA adopted the common spirit that was done by MPLA and the FNLA. The three major movements, MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, met in January 1974 at a meeting in Mombasa, and Kenya, under the leadership of President Jomo Kenyatta. It means that these three political parties or major movements were met in January 1974 in Mombasa, Kenya, under the leadership of President of Jomo Kenyatta. And at this meeting, the three major movements agreed to end all types of constitutes and propaganda which hampered unity and cooperation. To mean that following with that meeting that was held in Mombasa, Kenya, all three nationalistic movements were agreed that they have to eliminate or to stop the constitutes and the propaganda which were hampering or facing the unity and the cooperation among them to attain their self-rule. The MPLA, the largest and the strongest movement, took the reins of the state in spite of the civil wars. The situation wasn't the fascist South Africa invaded Angola in support of UNITA and the FNLA. It means that the situation wasn't when fascist South Africa invaded Angola in the support of UNITA and the FNLA. However, in June 1976, the MPLA's force and the MPLA's force and MPLA's force and the MPLA's force assumed the full control of Angola. It means that in June 1976, the MPLA's force assumed the full control of Angola. So we have seen a little explanation about the struggle for independence in Angola. So let us see the little explanation about Mozambique. In Mozambique, the nationalist movement championing the grievances of both the workers and peasants made in 1960. Due to the suppression of nationalist movements within Mozambique, nationalist movements were organized from outside by Mozambicans in exile. And this movement included the following in Mozambique. The first one was National Democratic Union of Mozambique, formed in southern Rhodesia in 1960. These were the nationalist movement that was taking place outside of Mozambique and to be directed towards Mozambique. But the nationalist movements were not within Mozambique, meaning that nationalist movements were taking place outside Mozambique or in exile, specifically in Tanganyika. The second one, or the second nationalist movement that was taking place in exile, was Mozambique African National Union, formed in Kenya in 1961. The another was African Union of Independent Mozambique, formed in Nyasaland or Malawi in 1961. By the end of 1961, all the three nationalist movements had shifted their headquarters to Dar es Salaam. In 1962, they joined to form Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, FRELIMO. FRELIMO concentrated on training cadres, party organization, and the mobilization of world support. Actual armed struggle began in Mozambique in 1964, and the final victory of FRELIMO and the people of Mozambique came in 1975, and Samuel Michael became the president. It means that the nationalist movement in Mozambique under FRELIMO it means that the actual armed struggle in Mozambique began in 1964, and the final victory of FRELIMO was attained in 1975, when Samuel Michael became the president of Mozambique. Let us see the reasons for the armed struggle in Angola and Mozambique. The reasons for armed struggle in Angola and Mozambique. The first one was banning of nationalist movements, as we have seen in the last explanation about Angola. It means the Portugal banned all nationalist movements in these colonies because she was not ready to grant independence. The nationalist movements in Mozambique were operating from outside. This complicated the struggle for independence that the Africans had to resort to the use of armed struggle. So you can see that the Portuguese were banning the nationalistic movements in the colonies or in these colonies because she was not ready to grant independence, and the Portuguese were claiming that the colonies were the part and parcel. So After looking the short explanation about Angola and Mozambique to use the armed struggle in attaining the independence, I'd like to wind up there, and on the last session we will proceed with the reasons. So now let me give you the exercise or the question which you have to do. The question is only one, and it is just explain the factors for the use of armed struggle in Zimbabwe. So I would like to end up there, and I welcome you in the next session. Have a good time.
Purchase your tracks today.